Hello everyone, I'm Connor Henderson. I'm joined today by PhD student Jessica Canfield, and we're going to be talking about doing cluster analysis for the purpose of marketing segmentation with the idea of picking key segments to target and position your brand for. So it's helping students with this case, which is data analytics case 1 or marketing engineering case 1. And the basic setup is that we're working for Intel, and Intel's looking to diversify their product lines by getting into Internet of Devices or Internet of Things, including making chips for things like smartwatches. So having their chips distributed in lots of devices that are connected to the internet that are constantly sensing information, getting that data up to cloud servers, processing that information, sending back information to the devices so they can make adjustments or inform decision makers to make adjustments. So basically, Intel's history was they pivoted from focusing on memory to processing, did very well, but kind of missed out on the mobile phone as they were focused on power, but not so much efficiency. And so other processors were better for keeping battery life from draining. And so losing out on the smartphones hurt Intel a lot, but thankfully all those smartphones send information to cloud services, such as like Instagram, right? That's done in the background on these big cloud servers. And a lot of those cloud servers use Intel processors. So they still have been doing well, but they kind of regret missing out on that. They've also missed out on a lot of the artificial intelligence, which uses graphical processing units, GPUs, instead of CPUs. And NVIDIA is like the big competitor in that space, which originally was for creating graphic images on computers like video games, but has been shown to be good for kind of artificial intelligence and just a bunch of different kind of computer vision cases. So Intel's looking to grow, and one thing they did is they bought a smartwatch. That smartwatch was the Basis Peak. It had a lot of sensors. It's kind of like an early predecessor to all the health and wellness sensors on Fitbit and on Apple Watch. But one difference was it wasn't as kind of fun and beautiful looking as Apple Watch, but had much better battery life and originally had a lot more sensors. It's now been pulled and is no longer a thing, but we're going to go back in time and pretend that Intel has just bought the watch and is going to come out with a refresh version of it. And who should they go after? What should they do for their brand? How should they position themselves? And also what partners they should work with. So I kind of just made up this case because I thought it'd be kind of a fun way to do it. But this analysis that resides behind it, I've actually used a lot, and companies use all the time to be more efficient with their marketing communication, align everything they do for a particular target segment, recognizing that customers are different and they have unique needs that they look for from the product. Some of those needs are sense of identity and sense of connection with a small group, and so it always pays to understand who customers are, the differences amongst them, what differences are relevant, and what differences could be used to mount a campaign to position yourself for them. So this is an example of a consulting project we did with the Trailblazers, where we surveyed a bunch of Portland area consumers about their entertainment preferences and then made recommendations for the Blazers on how they could do digital advertising that emphasize certain kind of aspects of the experience going to games that are customized for different groups of Portland consumers. And so the same process I'm going to overview today is what we used for this consulting project for the Blazers. We did another one for a baseball team in town. And for instance, they were sending a lot of Facebook ads based on demographics. So they segmented based on demographics, which isn't ideal because you end up kind of making some stereotypes around how certain people behave and what they're interested in. And it's better to try to get to the underlying needs and motivations that drive potential purchases in different categories, and therefore you can have your messaging reflect those needs and not be just based on demographics. Of course, demographics might correlate with those underlying needs, and if so, that's great because you can use tools like Facebook targeted ads to have Instagram ads and Facebook ads that are shown for the people that you expect will resonate most with certain messages. So for instance, with that baseball team, they were doing a lot of Facebook ads and Instagram ads targeting moms to bring their kids to the games. And after doing the segmentation analysis, we found there's this kind of cluster of not necessarily moms, but let's say women aged 30 to 40 um, or 30 to 50 that had kids or maybe didn't, but wanted to go out with their friends and escape their families and go have fun just with their friends. So they created a campaign called Mom's Night Out, which featured pictures of alcohol with just kind of the faded out background of the baseball players. And that ad campaign ended up being very effective. So before, the ads were mostly focused on bringing their kids, and that wasn't really the need or the motivation that was going to drive that audience to make purchases. So in this case, with the Blazers ad, we did a survey of a bunch of people, had a sample of about 1,000, did cluster analysis, and which grouped all the respondents into 7 different groups. We named them based on their characteristics and offered recommendations. So this group is really interested in basketball but on a budget. This group is more interested in just being socializing and focusing on local things. The haters weren't a good segment to target. They had no interest in what the Blazers had to offer. Northwest nightlife wasn't so much about basketball but just going out having a good time. These were serious basketball fans, shut up and watchers, less interested in all the festivities around the game but more about the game itself. You had the faithful fans and big spenders. And so kind of what you can see is that we had basic information on the demographics, but even better, we knew what they were seeking. If they were seeking bargains, festive atmosphere, did they care about sports or not? So there's a bunch of different questions we had them evaluate, and those informed the Facebook ads that we recommended being used, and we were able to see which Facebook ads had the biggest impact. And then from that, we could go ahead and provide additional suggestions on what the company should do in terms of engaging with that segment in a way that would resonate with their particular needs. And so since, for example, for this case, this is people who are looking for entertainment on a budget, and so they might also be looking to save money with their music listening, and so they might use Spotify's ad-supported model, and therefore reaching them through Spotify might be a good avenue. This group didn't care about sports, but loved supporting the local community. They had some social needs to fulfill and liked to go out with others. And so this ad focused on friends and drinking and being in a festive atmosphere. You can see there's no ad about basketball itself. Then this group didn't want to spend a lot of money. They don't enjoy fan culture. They're not interested in the local community. So this group was a group of people that were not going to be targeted. We're going to avoid spending money on them. Northwest nightlife, social butterflies, lots of entertainment preferences like diversity of entertainment, not that easily impressed, don't really care about local and not interested in the arts. So just want a variety of like big splashy bang entertainment. And so in this case, you could add that was connected to the Northwest, wasn't too much about basketball, was featuring the local brewery and how they had special tie-ins there. A recommended ad would be focusing on beers, friends, and the sports is this big entertainment event, more about the venue, less about the basketball. The shut up and watchers were much more interested in basketball themselves. They're very interested in kind of being serious and food and drinks, but not so much the fan culture. And so this group was focusing, the ads focusing on the players themselves and the skill of the players. So, Damian Lillard's the star, kind of focusing on that experience of being right next to the game. And the idea would be to kind of do some promotion with different media that focuses on the details of the sport. Faithful fans, they will splurge, they really like indulging, they love sports culture, but aren't kind of hardcore deep into the analytics and strategy. And so a good ad with these big spenders was showing the courtside seats, being right next to the action, spending a lot, feeling like you're splurging, versus like an ad featuring fans maybe in a higher level suite. Um, and lastly, we had some big spenders who maybe also would enjoy a courtside view. So anyways, you can kind of customize the recommendations for the needs, the motivations, and if it correlates with demographics you can observe. So in this case, I'm going to try to show you a bit of the process behind doing a project like that. So in this case, we pretend, back to the Intel, that we've gone ahead and surveyed a bunch of customers. So in this case, we asked alumni of the University of Oregon's Business School to complete a survey, and in doing so, $2 would be donated by Intel to our scholarship fund. This is imaginary, but we're going to assume that 1,000 alumni completed the survey for a response rate of 2%. So there's some issues with how representative that group is of all potential customers who might buy a smartwatch, but it was convenient, so that's where the data came from. And what we're going to try to do is understand, of these 1,000 people, what are similarities that kind of represent groups of consumers that are different from other groups. So those are called segments. And how can we analyze each of those segments in terms of the competitive intensity to try to win them. So like Apple Watch would be obviously a big competitor. And then also the attractiveness of them for Intel and their long-term ambitions. So once you find a segment that has a decent overlap in terms of not too much competitive intensity, but also attractive enough that they're worth going after, you can look through all the details of what they're interested in and come up with a refined product and communication strategy, go-to-market strategy that should resonate with that target segment. So there's a survey that's described here and all the questions that were asked on the survey. And with each of these, they also have a corresponding column in our data set. So it's important for all of the students working on this case to make sure that they understand how these labels map on to the actual items that were evaluated by the survey respondents. So they kind of go in order. So for instance, in terms of what this segment's looking for, they would rate on a scale of 1 to 7 from very unimportant to very important the ability to benefit from the latest and greatest. So that would be like innovation. Constant communication would be the ability to receive subtle notifications at all times about messages and emails from family, friends, and work. So being constantly tied in. So, they correspond to these columns where these are the respondents in column 1. And for each row, for each respondent, we know that like for this first person, innovation wasn't that important. It was only a 3 out of 7. Constant communication wasn't that important. Also only a 3 out of 7. But this create column, which is this third one, creative communication, scored the highest that we can see so far in this row, being a 5 out of 7, which would be the ability to send and receive creative and fun communication, such as pictures, emojis, and stickers. Now, the Basis Peak Watch did not allow for that creative, kind of rich communication. It did allow for the creative communication. So you can kind of know what your product strengths and weaknesses are and what changes you could make to your product and customize them for a particular segment. Okay, so we have a lot of information, a lot of answers about all these different needs and wants that people pursue when they buy technology devices. We also have price, so their willingness to pay. Imagine there's a new watch that leverages advances in several new technologies to offer the features you care about most. How much would you likely pay? So that's their willingness to pay for a watch that fit their needs. And then there's a bunch of other what we call discriminant information. These are more like demographics. They help us find people that we know what they care about. So we might know someone's into being an athlete or very concerned with their health and well-being, and we know that those motivations correlate with certain characteristics that we can identify in the general population. That's what these second set of questions are. And so the first set of questions are what we're going to call segmentation data. They're going to describe the differences in the customer group. And the second set of questions are going to tie into what we're going to call discrimination data, which is going to help us identify members of each segment. So like whether or not they have an iPhone. Obviously that's very relevant for competition in terms of an iPhone user might be more inclined to buy an Apple Watch. This next question is, does your company buy you technology devices? Perhaps we don't have to worry about selling directly to the consumer if we can sell it to the company, which is going to provide them, a smartwatch so they can be in constant communication for their work. What industry do they work in, right? Do they work in health, finance, sales, advertising, education? So we have all these different pieces of information that can help us identify them. We even know what media they consume, which can help inform our advertising or promotion strategies. So they use Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, YouTube, Netflix, Hulu, radio, podcasts, TV, newspapers or magazines. We ask if they have an Amazon Prime account. That's relevant for advertising, but also for kind of sales channels. We have age, gender, education, and annual income. So that's all the information we have on them, and they're organized into two kind of different spreadsheets, matched up by respondent ID number, in which we have this kind of discrimination data and segmentation data. Now, usually when a researcher would get this information, or in the past, they might do something like taking the average. So of everyone who filled out the survey, what's their average interest in timely information? And so you could get a total average score for all 1,000 people. The problem is that average is comprised of a bunch of people who are high on one thing and low on another thing. And so something in the middle wouldn't really fit well or resonate with either of those people. And so we want to recognize these underlying differences, put people in groups. I guess the joke is, or not the joke, but my mom would always say, "Oh, Connor, you're special. You're like a snowflake. There's no one like you. You're so unique." This is before snowflakes were like a derogatory internet meme. And so it's like we want to recognize that each customer is very unique from the others, but even snowflakes congregate together on mountaintops. And so we want to pick which mountaintop to climb. And so we want to see how all these individuals kind of group together on a multi-dimensional space. So we're going to kind of merge together all their answers across all these variables to get like this map of this kind of location space of needs and wants and see how people cluster together. So cluster analysis is really just looking at, it could be anything. It doesn't have to do anything with customers, but it's just looking how different units group together in spaces that are defined in this way, like mathematically based on numbers. So based on a number space. But you could look at clusters of DNA sequences of samples of the viral infection of coronavirus, for instance. I know that someone's doing cluster analysis on the DNA sequence up in Seattle. Or you could look at, different plants across an ocean bed. So cluster and cluster analysis is the general process we're going to use. Segments refers to the cluster of people within a consumer group or customer group. So when I say segment or cluster, they're going to be used interchangeably. Okay, so did I cover the background well, Jessica? Is there kind of relevant information or points you think I might have missed or questions that came up?
No, I think that you went over everything pretty clearly and succinctly. I read the case as well, and I don't think that there was something that I had questions about that wasn't covered in terms of the background information at a setup.
Cool. So the next question is, so how do you group respondents together so you find the like-minded customers and separate them out from separate customers? And the process that's used is this cluster analysis, which is a statistical technique. You can do it using free software. So R is a free software that's very powerful that people write code for, and you can just Google whatever you want to do in R, and there'll be code that you can copy and paste into your R Studio or whatever interface you use to use R, and it's all free. So I definitely recommend that if someone is willing and interested in doing this kind of in a more intense or elaborate way. For my class, I don't require any students to do the actual analysis. I provide the input files and the output files. And if you are able to spend a little bit of money and you're interested in kind of some basic analytics for marketing, I would recommend this ingenious.biz, which is this marketing engineering website. And in it, it's a cloud-based tool where you can upload a lot of data and then do all types of analyses. So if you upload your data and format it correctly, you can do segmentation analysis, which is what we're doing today. That's cluster analysis, but for the purpose of marketing. You can do brand positioning, comparing your brand to competitors and how you're perceived. Conjoint analysis, looking at trade-offs that your customers have. So do you want more miles per gallon, or do you want to be able to carry more cargo in your car? Right? Those things are inversely related to each other. Everybody likes both, but there's a trade-off. So which is most important to your customer's purchase decision? That's something you can try to find out with conjoint analysis. You can do sentiment analysis with text, predictive modeling, try to optimize price, lots of different things. Okay, today we're just going to do segmentation analysis. So I've already uploaded the data that was in this spreadsheet, which was downloaded and formatted correctly from the survey results of the fake survey we did. And now it's kind of in this format ready to be analyzed. So you can see these are all the observations, these are all the variables, and these are the values for each variable. So we're going to segment or group people based on their answers to these questions. In doing so, it's important to note that the format or the scale used to measure everyone's interest on all the variables needs to be the same. Otherwise, you need to do a standardization. So in this case, we have price in dollars versus everything else on a 1 to 7 basis. So we need to standardize everything because otherwise any differences in price would get a lot of attention by the model, because you could see like a 10% difference in price would be a unit difference of maybe $20 or 20 versus a 10% difference in a 1 to 7 scale might be a unit difference of like 0.5. Okay, so that's one thing to note. Another thing to note is if you have too many survey questions, it'll do something called factor analysis, which is looking for similarities across columns. Cluster analysis is looking for similarities across the rows, but factor analysis is looking for similarities across columns. So looking if there's correlation among your variables and saying these three variables tend to move together in terms of people's responses. Let's collapse them into like a higher level factor rather than just focusing on these underlying characteristics. In this case, I don't have too many survey questions, so I can just keep them as they are. You don't need to worry about the number of questions for discrimination data. This is just saying, okay, once people have been put into groups based on these characteristics, can we predict which group someone would be in based on the known information about who they are, for more of like a demographic or media consumption characteristic. Okay, so the analysis is really straightforward. You just click on segmentation. You can either make them give you the results putting people into a set number of groups. So I could force the number of segments to be, let's say, like 9 different groups. Or I could kind of let it do whatever it thinks is best based on the kind of statistical patterns that's observed. So I'll just do that for the first demonstration. I need to make sure to standardize the data because, again, they're not all on the same scale. I have pricing that could range from anything from like $100 to, let's say, $500, versus everything else is on a 1 to 7. I do want to let them know that I have discriminant data, which is more that kind of observational demographic data that used to identify people. And then I just go ahead and run the analysis. In this case, there's lots of different outputs. I've provided my students with the output in Microsoft Excel, but for this, I'll just show you on the web to do a quick demonstrate real quickly. So it doesn't take a whole lot of time. It's running in the cloud. If you do R, you'd run it on your own computer. You download the R software, and it would provide you a lot of the exact same output. This you have to pay money for. With R, it's free. You just got to spend the time to figure it out. So in this case, it's got some additional formatting and commentary that you wouldn't get in R. So it's gone ahead and classified all 1,000 respondents as belonging to one of 3 different segments or one of 3 different clusters, if you use the more generic term. And it basically said that from a statistical standpoint, that's what it thinks is the most kind of parsimonious way to group people. So if we kind of made 1,000 people, we could put them into, let's say, 10 groups of 100 each, but that might not describe the kind of differences among customers very well. Maybe some of those groups actually have customers in them that are very similar to each other, and so they could be kind of put together and further simplify our set of output. If we said there was just two groups, that might be an oversimplification, right? There's the old joke, there's two types of people in the world: those that like to put people into groups of two, and those that don't. I'm in the second group. So, anyways, although it has said from a statistical standpoint, three groups is pretty efficient. They say using statistical criteria exclusively, putting people into three groups is fine, but they want to recognize that managerial judgment is going to make a big difference, right? So let's say I have two people that are very different from each other in terms of height. One person's 5 foot tall, the other person's 7 foot tall, but they have the exact same size head, right? So if I'm selling pants, the differences in height, it matters a lot. And so I would want to make sure they're considered separate consumers or in two different groups. But if I'm selling them hats, I don't care that there's a difference in height. So I could collapse them into one group and just say, people of a certain size, circumference head. And so it really requires you as the manager to go through repeatedly and look at the different options in terms of, should I make things simple and put them into fewer groups, and that way it'll be really efficient to communicate, right? It's really efficient to just say there's two types of people in the world, but it's missing a lot of truth, right? It's an oversimplification. Should I keep all my consumers kind of separate and say, no, there's actually 1,000 different people and each one's a precious snowflake and I don't want to group them together? Well, that's just going to be information overload, and I won't be able to efficiently communicate with my team. I won't be able to make decisions. I won't be able to make campaigns. And also, people like to feel like they belong to a group. And so, by a kind of, to some extent, no one wants to be considered a sheep, but people do want to feel like they belong to something. So, you can kind of build a brand around bringing people together who feel like they have some shared values or shared interests. Okay, so the next thing to note is there's this dendrogram, and it basically is a graphical representation of how different everybody is from each other. And so on this y-axis, it's called the distance, or how distant two groups are from each other. And over here, it just has every single individual respondent kind of grouped together, such that at the very top, this would be if you grouped everybody together, there would be a lot of underlying differences that are going to be missed. That's just taking an overall average score for everybody. Okay, so I basically wouldn't be picking up on differences in head circumference or height if I just said everybody's the same, like all humans are the same. I was like, no, actually, there's lots of differences. If I say all humans are unique, then I can't really make decisions. So what the software does is it looks for people who answered the questions very similarly, and it groups them together. And it starts out with people who maybe answered all the questions the exact same. And then most of the questions the exact same, but a few questions were slightly different. And then maybe none of the questions were the exact same, but they were all kind of similar. So maybe they were only off by like one or two. And so it's constantly looking for the most similar people it can smush together to create a bigger group, like a mega group, right? In this case, it has three groups. It's got the red group, the blue group, and the green group. But if you look at it, you could further split out the green group into like two smaller groups. So, for instance, this kind of part over here on the left and this part over here on the right are actually not that similar to each other. Same thing with the red. You got this group over here on the left and then this big group on the right that aren't that similar to each other. We know they're not that similar to each other because on the y-axis there seems to be a lot of distance between the groups. Okay? So if we decided to go ahead and say, no, let's not use three groups to classify all the consumers. Let's have four clusters, four groups. What would happen would be this red group would be split off into two kind of smaller groups where there'd be this kind of cluster over here on the left and then this big group over here on the right. If we said let's make 5 groups, this red group would be split up again, where this kind of group of people over here would be separate from this group over here on the right. So whichever kind of place there's more distance among members of the group, there's more differences that are now being ignored as they've been smushed together. Those are the first places we're going to pull people apart if we want to describe our segment with more people. Was that explanation somewhat clear, Jessica?
That explanation was clear. The one question that I do have still, though, is so let's say we are going to split the segment into more than the original 3 that they suggested, right? So how you were talking about breaking it into 4 or 5 with the
Yeah.
red. At what point would you increase the number of, like, could you use this to decide whether you're splitting the red or the green? Like within the green, there's 2 clear groups as well, right?
Yeah, if you use this software, it's going to make you kind of split the group that's most different from each other according to the software. So I can't say like, so like there's more distance between members in the red group than there is in the green group. You see how the green group's got a little bit lower
Right.
spot there, a
Distance score,
distance,
whatever.
than the
Yeah.
red group up here. So the software, if I said let's go from 3 to 4 groups, the software would automatically split up the red group. It wouldn't let me split up the green group. If I want to split up the green group, I would have to go from not just 3 to 4 or not just 4 to 5, but I'd have to actually go from 5 to 6. And so if I had
Okay.
6 groups, that's where the point would be where this green group would get split up. So if I was interested in targeting members of the green group, but I wanted to be like really hyper focused, like really niche focused from my initial launch, because I want to have like the perfect messaging for somebody rather than kind of okay messaging for a lot of people, I would
Mm-hmm.
have to say 6 segments, even though I'm going to ignore all these people over here because they don't fit with my product, right?
Okay.
So it creates more segments, but I'm just going to say those are all the people that don't resonate with my offering. And so I'm going to go to 6, even though really I just need 3. I need the details over here and then everybody else. So it's always this,
Okay.
as the analyst, you have to know the context really well to decide like how fine grained to get versus how abstract to get. I am going to have students create a table that shows like how much distance there is between groups to evaluate different options. So it's going to be
Okay.
kind of difficult, but I'll force the students to do it. Um,
Does the distance value, can that be interpreted as anything, or is it just a relative measure?
it's based on, like if you look down here, this gray prot, it's based on SSE, so that's sum of squared error. And so basically what happens is it says for all these, let's say these 5 people who are all slightly different, there's a midpoint in between them. So like this central point of
Mm-hmm.
kind of, let's say a gathering point. It's like if you had a neighborhood and it's like let's all go meet up at the park, or let's all go meet up at, Prince Buckler's ice cream. Well, that might be the central point for all the friends, and so they all meet at that central point. But the distance between Prince Buckler's and all the friends was going to be maybe not that distant for this friend, but really distant for that friend. So it adds up
Okay.
the distance from that central point. Now,
I see.
when
Okay.
I say central point, I'm talking about an abstract math land. So it just looks at all the numbers and it kind of like smushes them together and calls their a central point. Um, but anyways, this screenshot shows like, well, if there's only one segment, if we just say there's one cluster, like all customers are the same, and let's look at the average score on each variable and we can see which variable is most important, that would have this 1300 point, which would be the sum of squares of the error between the central point and every single person in the world. Um, as we split people up into 2 groups, the amount of error within each group falls because now I've said like, okay, everyone's not the same. You got, some people. I like to think of it in terms of populations, like in the West Coast. So just saying like everybody in the West Coast is the same. Well, in that case, you might think like the population center of the West Coast would be Northern California. There's a lot of people in Southern California, and there's some people in Oregon and Washington. Now, if you split it up, you say, okay, now we got Californians and we got Pacific Northwest. You split it up more, you say now we got Californians, Pacific Northwest, but we'll split up California into NorCal and SoCal. You go again and you say, okay, now we got 4 groups, and we'll say we got NorCal, SoCal, Oregon, and Washington, right? As you keep kind of subdividing, you have each individual is closer and closer to their central point because you have more central points for people to be close to. Um, Now this is picked 3 segments to put us in because it's looking for this elbow where it's looking, say, like how much like kind of loss in air or decrease in air do we have every time we split people off, and it's seeing big gains in decreases in air from going from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3, but the amount of kind of improvement in fit or
Mm-hmm.
the amount of distance that's reduced within groups as you go from 3 to 4 is just a lot smaller than it was when you went from 2 to 3. And so the statistically it says like we haven't really gained a lot when we went from 2 to 3. And we gained a lot when we went from 2 to 3. We didn't gain so much when we went from 2 to 4. So we'll kind of stop things off at just 3 groups overall.
Right.
If you were looking within your own customer base, let's say I have a million customers or, you know, 60 million customers on Netflix. Okay. Well, then I can, using technology, I can cluster people into maybe like 60,000 different groups, and each group will have a customized different home screen when they come in, right? To the first time
Right.
they ever use Netflix, I can know like where they live, any information about what type of credit card they use, what type of internet they're using. Like I can just know all this information before someone even signs up on Netflix. What website did they hear about me from? And I can put them into a group in which the first time they sign in, the first recommended movies and TV shows will be slightly different. But it all depends on like how much of the differences in your customers that you're going to use is actually going to be actionable. For high level branding, it's good to have fewer than 9 segments in any industry typically. Because anything more than that, it's too much information, it's information overload. You can't kind of create a messaging campaign saying there's like 1,000 different customers in the world. But within your own customer base, if you have a big customer base, you can almost create like a bazillion different segments using technology to do customized different interventions that might work a little bit better for each segment. With the Blazers, we classified people into, I don't have it anymore, 7 different groups. So all of Portland was put into 7 different groups based on how they answered the questions. Okay, so in this case, it recommends 3, but what that lacks is any sense of the context, the problem that the manager is trying to deal with. And so what I'm going to recommend my students do, or require my students to do, is actually start with 9 and then get some sense of the amount of information that's lost as you take different groups of people and smush them into a bigger group. Because each time we kind of put people into a group, you start thinking them not as individuals, but as a kind of stereotypical person that represents that group. And obviously, each individual of that group is slightly different. And the more different they are from that kind of midpoint or that kind of center point, the more information or details about who they are gets lost as someone said they care about, the creative communication, a 7 out of 7, but they got put in a group that the average is only a 5 out of 7. So we think it's not critical for them, but for that individual, it actually was critical. So anyways, this is just kind of helping the analyst decide how to characterize all the respondents into these big groups without even worrying about what's the nature of the members of each group. As you go further down into the report, now it starts to describe the members of each group. Each segment is the terminology we're going to use. So in this case, it has segment 1 has got 40% of all respondents in it. Segment 2 has about 20%, and segment 3 has about 40%. So you can use some of that size information in a business context. Maybe you want to go after a bigger segment, or maybe you think there's room to split it up further. Interesting, these 2 bigger groups, group 1 and group 3, are the ones that would get split up first. There's this smaller group of just 200. They're more kind of tightly unified, and so they would get split up later if you went from 3 groups into, let's say, 4 or 5, 6 or 7 clusters to describe everyone. Um, this report will show us is the average score on each question for members of that group and compare that to the population as a whole. So if you look at across everybody, the average score on a 1 to 7 scale was 4.1 for this first variable. But segment 1, they were not that interested in innovation on a relative basis, where segment 3 was super into it. And being green means that their average response was statistically significant above the mean, and being red means they were statistically significant below the mean. So using a p of zero point zero 0.05, you can kind of see this green graph where they show for each group. This is segment 1, segment 2, segment 3. Um, Group 1 was kind of below the mean on everything except for whatever this photo variable is. Group 3 I just wanted it all, except for they could care less about timely information, at least relative to everybody else. And Group 2 had kind of more of a scatter of things they cared a lot about and things they cared less about compared to everybody as a whole. Um, there's also kind of a graphing of um, the different segments in terms of what they were interested in, but it's comprised of only two components. So there's the y-axis and the x-axis. So it looks at all the different answers to all the different questions and sees that some of those questions are kind of answered the same consistently, and so they kind of collapse them into these two components. So you can see that this group down here, blue, they're more focused on like price, timely information, constant communication, a sturdy device, and task management. So maybe very practical concerns, very pragmatic. This group 3 is really into photos. That's one thing that was interesting for them. Some of them cared about creative communication. Some of them cared about price, but in general, these are like the four most influential factors, at least in this two-dimensional space. And this other group cares a lot about kind of athletics, style, wellness, and some creative communication. So even within each segment, you can see there's a lot of variance that's not being captured. There's a lot of differences among people. The further they are out on this space, the more they care about it. So like this person, and this person cared the most about photos. This person in the red group cared the least about photos, but was still put in the red group. There's some other variables that are not captured in this two-dimensional space. It does provide you a quick sense of who people are. Segment membership tells you for each respondent, maybe you know their email address, you know their contact information, it tells you which group they're in. So you could go from having a list of email addresses to putting people into groups and then coming up with tactics for each member of each group. Okay. The discriminant analysis kind of gives you the information on these descriptors or these demographic type variables. So like the percent of people in each group that have an iPhone. Segment 1, only 36% of people had an iPhone. Segment 2 was about 56%, and segment 3 was almost 70%. The average age was a little bit higher in group 1 and group 2, segment 1 and segment 2, than group 3 tended to be younger. Right? What type of media is consumed by people? Well, group 3 didn't watch much TV. But is a big user of Snapchat, which kind of fits with the age thing, right? So you can kind of know where to advertise and be more likely to reach people in that segment that would be more likely to respond to your ads favorably. Segment 2, their company tends to buy the technology, so maybe we could do like a business to business sales approach with company 2. Maybe it's a company that cares about the healthcare costs for the employees. So a health and wellness watch that gets their employees to be healthier, they would pay for because they help pay for the insurance, the health insurance. So that would be like a way to use the information to inform your strategy. Okay, I think that's kind of a quick overview of the most important information of that output. But let me transition to, I did this several times and I gave my students the output with 9 clusters, with 5 clusters, and with 4 clusters. And I'm going to make them choose to either have 4 clusters to describe everybody or to do 5 clusters. So what this dendrogram is here is just the top half of that graph we saw with the 9 solution. Right? Here's the 9 with everybody, and if you break it down to just like the top 5, then it just kind of cuts off kind of all these differences under 5 and just focuses on these 5 groups. But okay, so what I want students to do is get a sense of how much information is lost each time kind of subgroups are smushed together to create supergroups. And the way to do that is to start with the 9 segment solution and build out a little table. So you might say number of segments, and one segment really isn't a segment, it's just putting everybody. But we could go all the way to 9. And what we start out with is saying, well, with 9, well, if you had everybody originally, you'd have no information lost. But once you put people to 9, all this distance that's going to start being ignored as like all these people put into small groups, it's like our starting point of information lost. And so we could go ahead and capture that by kind of just eyeballing how much information has already been lost for each of these groups. But we are just going to take that as some given starting point number. And what we can see though is when we go from 9, so this is like our kind of unknown starting point, right? Total information lost. But we're going to see additional information lost each time we put people into kind of supergroups. And so what would happen if we went from 9 clusters, as you see here, to just 8 clusters? So we describe all 1,000 respondents as belonging to one of 8 groups. The 2 groups that are going to get smushed together are this kind of orange group and this pink group, because they are the most similar to each other, as in the least amount of information would be lost if they were put together. It'd be like if we're a company that cares about where people live. Maybe we do like some local customization of our product. This would be like putting together Eugene and Springfield. Right? They're basically the same location compared to like other cities on the West Coast. So we can just put them together, and you can eyeball it and see that about 20, the distance between them is about 20. So that's how much additional information would be lost when we go from 9 to 8. So this would be what I'd say additional info lost. And we're going to say that from whatever we started with at 9, we're going to say 20 is our additional information lost, right? The next group that would get put together would be these blue and this green one, because they're also pretty similar, and they're also going to be about 20. So if we went from 8 groups now where these have been put together, and now we have 8 groups, we say, now let's go further. Let's simplify our life. Let's say that there's only 7 groups we're going to put people in. Well, we'd create a super group out of this smaller blue and green group, and that would be additional 20 information that would be lost. Okay. The next point would be putting this purple and this green group, this blue group together, this turquoise group together. And if you recognize this middle kind of chute, that's what we saw in our report of the 3 groups, right? That's these people right here. That's them getting put together. And you see it's similar, it's a little bit past 20 at that point. So in this 9, if those got combined into a supergroup, we'd say, let's say that's like 25. Okay? Does that, seem to be reasonable? Sure.
Yeah.
Why not? Like, we don't have to be precise. We're just getting a sense of how much information is lost. So if this was putting together, let's say, Eugene and Springfield, maybe this was putting together Portland and Lake Oswego groups or whatever, or Portland and Vancouver, Washington. Okay, so this is going to kind of form Oregon over here. Maybe this is like Tacoma and Seattle. So it kind of puts that together. And then maybe this is kind of NorCal, LA, San Diego, right? So you kind of see how we're putting together people that are similar, but they are still differences. Like LA and San Diego are not the same. Like even Eugene and Springfield are not the same. There's some cultural differences, whatever. But we just kind of start putting them together. And so, all right, Seattle and Tacoma got put together. Their difference was 25. The next point where we could simplify our life was we could put all of these people together. So we just put all of Oregon together, and that would lose an additional 30 bits of information, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we would put uh, LA and San Diego together, and that might be, let's say, 33. Um, if we put all of California together, now we're at like 35, or let's say 36. If we put all the Northwest together, now we're jumping up here to 55. And if we put everybody on the West Coast together, we'd be at 70. So that's an additional information that we would have had available to us to make decisions that has been lost every time we or we simplify things and put people together. So we might want to know the cumulative info lost at each stage. So again, we're starting with 9 as our starting point, which is kind of the most unique or the most kind of uh, you wouldn't want to go further in terms of having more segments in a context where you're doing big branding type decisions, like high level brand strategy, firm strategy. Like describing a segment or a marketplace as more than 9 segments is a little bit kind of overly detailed for that problem set, especially early on in a product category. So we're just going to take that as our baseline. And so the additional information loss would be 20, and then it'd be equal to what we've lost already plus any new information lost. So now we've lost 40. At the end, we get up to 289 total bits of information that we could have had available to us that we lost along the way, right?
Right.
And then the next thing we could do is we could calculate like the percent of total at each point, which would be equal the additional information lost over the cumulative information lost. And what I want students to get a sense of, oops, I forgot to lock it in. Gotta lock in K. What I want students to get a sense of is that although this is abstract information, kind of an
Mm-hmm.
abstraction, we can see along the way that we're losing kind of more and more information that would have been available as to improve our decision making as a manager. And this first kind of group, we haven't even lost 10% of the total information. So I'm completely fine with combining groups, these two groups together, these two groups together, and these two groups together. All right, so that would
Right.
equal, we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 5 groups. So yeah, put these together, put these together. So I'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So having 5 segments is the first time we lose 10% of information. So I'm going to ask my students, for this case, to first evaluate in detail the output of a 5 segment solution,
Mm-hmm.
next to consider a 4 segment solution. I'm going to, even though statistically 3 isn't that much worse than 5 or 4, right? We're only losing a little bit more information at each point. We can also
Right.
look at it from a cumulative standpoint. Um, so we could look at the cumulative information lost so far divided by the total information that we could lose, right? And let me
Mm-hmm.
lock that in again. So eventually at the top, it's got to be 100%, right? So if we kind of put everybody into one, we've lost all potential information we could have gained by splitting people up into groups. But in this case, by the time we get to 5, we've lost about 33% of the total information. When we get to 4, we've lost 44%. When we go down to 3, even though statistically it looks fine, according to the first analysis I ran, we've now lost over 50% of the information we could use for decision making. So I kind of draw that as a
Hmm.
line. So I say, okay, I don't like going past 3, and I'm okay with losing more than 6, or having fewer than 6 groups. So I want students to evaluate describing all the segments as either putting everybody into 4 groups, which is a little bit simpler, right? Very parsimonious. There's only 4 groups of consumers to study and understand, or 5 groups, which is just one extra, which means one of those 4 groups is going to be split out into 2, which would really be this blue group here and this green group here. Right? They would either be
Right.
combined together or split out. What I want my students to do is to kind of go look at the output, to study the differences between the groups and decide if putting these people together is good because it simplifies things and it makes things easier for me as a decision maker, or bad because some difference between them could be relevant to my business. It goes back to the thing with hats versus pants. Right? If I'm selling hats, I don't care that they're different heights. If I'm selling pants, I do care that they're different heights. So you have to look at the differences that are going to be kind of lost as they get put together and decide if that difference is relevant to you as a decision maker. So the way to do that, so this is kind of the output I expect my students to produce. And if they watch this
Hmm.
video, it should be relatively easy to follow along and create something similar. And hopefully they get what is behind these numbers, right?
Right.
It's an abstraction of what's going on, right? We're not really understanding why these groups get put together and why like these consumers aren't put together with them, but it's a good starting point for us to go further and deeper with our analysis. So that's kind of the all I look for students to engage with this spreadsheet report number 9, which was an output from that website. Next, I wanted to go look at report number 5 and report number 4 in detail and decide, like you can see it right here, right? 5, you got these separate colored groups of consumers all kind of bundled
Hmm.
together. With 4, they've kind of made this super group right here, and you can see that that's the group that has the most information that's already been lost because I don't know, I think we said San Diego and LA, right? We smushed them together. We got the Northwest, or this is Washington, Oregon. Um, Now we kind of group them together. So I want my students as detectives to figure out if they think it's cool for us, our business, to put them together. In order to do that, they need to have already done some analysis of our own company, our own strengths and weaknesses, and the competition to see if these differences in customers is going to be relevant or not. So that means they got to read the case. They might have to look online for separate information. I include a link to this one kind of YouTube video where they kind of give detailed information about what the Basis Peak was as a product. There's also online reviews, articles that they could read. I don't care if they go into a lot of information, but just in the real world, if they were actually managing this product category, yeah, like go read a ton, think a ton, talk to tons of customers. And the purpose of this case, just get enough information that your decisions are coming from somewhere and they're not just like completely pulled out of the wind. Um, okay, so in comparing 5 versus 4, what they need to do is go ahead and look at the segment description.
Hmm.
Especially, I want them to study these differences across consumers. So, like, you can make the numbers pop by doing some conditional formatting. Um, but just seeing, like, among the segments, where are they high, where are they low on these different variables, especially compared to
Hmm.
the population as a whole, understanding the size of each segment. And what's really critical is to know which of these 2 groups is going to get smushed together to make the supergroup if instead of having 5 different clusters, I went ahead and had just 4 different clusters. So the way to do that is you go to segment description and you look at the membership. So of all the respondents, this is all, there's 1,000 of them.
Hmm.
The model puts each of them into a group, into a segment. And I want to know of them which ones get moved from their kind of current assigned cluster to kind of get smushed together. And so I don't need to take a ton. Let's say I'll just take the first 100 people
Mm-hmm.
And I'll go ahead and look at the 5-segment solution. And I just want to see if these are different. Because for somebody, they're going to be split out into a different group. So like this person has a -1, this person has a -1. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So this person in before, in the 3-segment solution, they were in segment 3 and they got put into segment 4. This group was in segment 4 and got put into 5. This one was in 4, got put into 5. Um, a lot of what I see mostly is people that were assigned to segment 4 in the 4-segment solution that
Mm-hmm.
got split out and put into segment 5. So then now they belong to number 5.
Right.
Um, and um, let's see, where else is there anyone? Well, these aren't relevant. For any of these, so I also have some people that were in cluster 3 that are now put into cluster 4.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so this is when I have 5, when I can put people into 5 groups, I have people from 4 going into group 5, and I have some people in group 3 staying in 3. Okay, I have some people in 3 going into 4, and um, so yeah, everyone who was in group 4 gets put into group 5, and I basically split people who were in group 3. Some of them stay in group 3, and some of them get put into this new group 4. Does that make sense? So
Mm-hmm.
let me kind of capture that again because it's kind of confusing. So if I look at previously what I had in this 4-segment solution, okay, um, let's see. Everybody who's in this group, I think, is going to be called that they belong into group number 5. So let's see if that's the case. We look at here and see there's no differences in any of the answers between what was someone in cluster 4 to now what is someone in cluster 5. So we just
Right.
relabeled everybody who was in cluster 4 as now we're just calling them 5. And what happened was people that
Mm-hmm.
were in cluster 3, some of them got split up into cluster 4. So cluster
Right.
3 and 4 together account for 284 people, or 29% of the sample. If we go look at the 4-segment, if we describe the 7 4 segments, that's yeah, 29% of the sample, or 284. Okay, so this segment 3 is the one we have to study a lot, and we
Mm-hmm.
have to compare this kind of supergroup of cluster 3 to in group 5. Um, let's let me do it like this. So I have this supergroup of cluster 3 versus these, splitting them up into 2 different groups, right? And what I want to see
Mm-hmm.
is um, this would be, let's say, our supergroup. Yeah, that's 284. I want to see if these differences are interesting to me. So I might, there's a lot of things I could do to evaluate it, but I'm going to have my students, um, dig into these differences and look for anything that might be particularly interesting to them. So um, that might be relevant for their decision making. And if I
Mm-hmm.
think these differences, so if I think these differences between these 2 groups are important, then I'm going to make sure to keep them
Mm-hmm.
apart, and I'm going to describe my segment my cluster is 5 different groups. I'm going to say everybody belongs into 5 groups. If I think these differences are not important, I'm just going to combine them together and make life simple and say, okay, everybody belongs into one of 4 different groups. Okay, so what are some key differences? Okay, well, just looking at it, this creative communication is a big difference. For some people love it, for some people just think it's kind of nice. Um, how kind of sturdy the device is, I think that's what it stands for. I forget what the exact questions were. Question Group 3 kind of needs it. Group 4 could care less. They're just breaking things all the time, or they always buy the insurance policy or whatever. Those are like those people that walk around with iPhones without a cover on or whatever. Photo, uh, Group 3 could care less about photos. So like Group 3 would sacrifice being able to look at photos or take photos or whatever in order to have a more sturdy device. The opposite with Group 4. Now, if we're going to have, let's say, the ability to take a picture with our watch, which I don't even know if any watches can, but let's say we figured out a way to do it, then it would be important to have these groups separate because only some of them care about it, whereas other ones don't. If we're not going to do that, then who cares? We can collapse them, right? So for all of these, you kind of need a sense of, are these differences going to be important for our decision making? You can also look at the discriminant analysis and say, um, does uh, are there differences between segment 3 and segment 4 that are important to us? Or are the differences not that important, so we can just smush them together? So for instance, group 3 has, a lot of them have iPhones, which means they probably wouldn't be uh, a good target for us if we're coming out with an iWatch rival, Apple Watch rival. But group 4, they don't really have iPhones, so maybe they'd be a good target for us. So I need my students to use their managerial background to think through the case, think through where kind of the competition's strong, think through the basis peak. I complicate things even further by asking my students to consider the possibility of partnering with another technology company or another company. So I say they can form a partnership with Amazon, Aetna, which is a health insurance company, or Google to come out with a smartwatch that's a collaboration with each of those. Now in 2020, Google has gone ahead and bought Fitbit, so maybe they wouldn't want to partner with us. But before then, maybe Google would have. They're also competing for cloud services, so that could be a place. Amazon's got Alexa. They like having devices, but they don't really have a device yet. Maybe they'd partner with us. Aetna cares about health and wellness of people. Maybe they'd partner with us. So my students not only have to consider the strengths of Intel's capabilities and the Basis Peak's capabilities, but also what a potential partner would bring to the table. And then consider if this segment 3 is going to be kind of a prime segment to go after. If they're going to go after segment 1 and they think like that's the place where there's not that much competition and a good fit with us, then you might as well just group everyone together. If you're not, then you want to keep them apart. So all I ask from my students is just to go ahead and do some considerations and tell me if they think those differences are material or not and why. So they could focus in on, for instance, price and say, for the 5 segment group, segment 3 is willing to pay $240. Segment 4 is only willing to spend 202, and therefore, like, because I'm gonna go after segment 4, I need to make sure I come in at a lower price point. Versus if I smush them together, the average price point would have been $230, which is lower than what some of them are willing to pay and higher than what some of the other ones are willing to pay. So that's the kind of process of first just organizing all the respondents into groups. Did I cover that clearly to you as a first time?
Yeah,
You haven't done a
that was
segmentation
clear.
analysis before, have you?
Not recently.
Okay. So
Or
you're a
using
somewhat
these
novice,
software either.
maybe not as much as my students, but uh, enough to represent them, hopefully. Um, okay, so for this case, let's say I'm going to go with the 4 segment solution. Okay. the next part of the task is to go ahead and rate the attractiveness of each segment on a scale of 1 to 7. So I need to basically, I'm just going to get rid of the 5 segment because it'll be easier for me to do the work because I can do, you know, 25% less work if I have 4 segments than 5 segments to evaluate them. But what I want to know is just an attractiveness, and I'm going to rate all of them on a score 1 to 7. So let's say what's going to come into my rating. Or I might think about the size of the segment. Oh, it doesn't like that symbol, but size, let's say growth, um, let's say willingness to pay, um, cost to serve. Um, these are all things that are going to impact, my profitability. Maybe I have other considerations like my fit with my brand. Um, uh, I don't know. Anyways, you can have like a multidimensional kind of assessment. And so for each of these, you might rate it on a scale of 1 to 7. So like, for instance, this segment 4 is the smallest of the 4. So it might get a score of like a 2 on a score of 1 to 7 for size. For segment 1's the biggest, and maybe, 40% of the market, pretty big. Let's name it, let's give it that a 7. Um, this one maybe is like a 4, and this one would be, say, like a 6. So this is crude, and you'd want to have a more sophisticated version of this. But on every kind of dimension you care about, you could rate on a 1 to 7, and then you could do some type of effort to combine. You could have managers vote. You could care a lot about brand. I don't care exactly what goes into my students' ratings of attractiveness, but I want them to have some thoughtful process behind evaluating how attractive each segment is, like how much they'd want to go after them. Okay. And then the next consideration in the test is so you want to name them, you want to understand them. I kind of skipped over that. But then you want to do and assess the strength of competitors and the strength of yourself with all the different partners you could use. So to do that, you might go ahead and put like Apple Watch, Fitbit. Who else is a smartwatch maker?
Uh-oh, I don't think I know of.
I don't know either. I think there's like Android Wear, Samsung, let's say. Um, and then I got, you know, uh, my current thing, which is the basis, peak or whatever. And then I might say basis plus Amazon, and then basis plus Google, and basis plus Aetna. And I go through for all these kind of factors, and I just do some rating of my competitors and myself in terms of how I think my product or my potential products would score. So, like for Fitbit, for example, they put a lot into wellness, so we might rate them like a 6. Apple back in the day was less so into was more into wellness, let's say, than athletics, because they couldn't recognize if you were on a bike. They first it wasn't waterproof. Now at this time, I think they've invested a lot here, so you'd probably score them higher. But we can kind of go back in time. Um, you know, creative communication, Apple scores really high on that. Fitbit probably less so. I don't know if they have like all the emojis and texting that can be done there. Maybe they're like a 4, for instance. The basis was like a 1. You couldn't do anything like other than text, I think. Now they could improve that, but as a starting point. So, anyways, you just kind of rate the competition and yourself in terms of all the dimensions to which consumers are going to be evaluating products, and that gives you a sense of the competitive strength. And then you can see the alignment with each of the segments, and then that can give you an idea of where you can actually win going after a segment. It's important to consider relevant discriminant data. So like if they have an iPhone or not, right? We talked about that before. If this is like percentage you can convert into, what percent of respondents have an iPhone. Segment 3, in this world, 75% of them do, so we wouldn't want to go after them. If we split it into 5 groups, there's one group that was like 80% have an iPhone, and there's a smaller group that only like 40% had one. So there's within this segment 3, if we split them out further, we could find a group to go after that aren't necessarily going to be buying an Apple Watch. Um, Other things that are relevant, like if they have Amazon Prime, of course, if one of our partners would be Amazon, those would be customers that would be easy to access. If their company pays for technology devices, that could be relevant. Maybe with Google, we already have a relationship with them, with the companies. Or with Aetna, we could get them to buy their employees' watches. So there's lots of different kind of bits of information in here that could inform your downstream decisions. So that's that next step, is just kind of getting a sense of the competitive landscape, thinking about attractiveness, and then choosing one of these segments to go after. And then lastly, to end the case, they need to just identify the segment they believe is the best target and go ahead and try to offer some recommendations about how they would go about launching the product. So assuming they could do a little bit of tweaks with the product, depending on their partner, and do a new and improved, and then assuming we're going back in time to 2017, how would they recommend launching that product? So I think on the actual case assignment page here, I give some information about kind of going forward and giving a plan of how to attack and a go-to-market strategy. So that can include communications, distribution, pricing, product, the full marketing mix. Doesn't have to be like an extremely detailed answer, but just showing a little bit so I can imagine what it would be like to go ahead and put together a plan of attack. Just kind of hinting at what it would look like is sufficient. So that's the assignment. The kind of key to doing this well is having good data. So if you have a well-designed survey that's collected from a good set of respondents, and you can analyze it and look at how different observable characteristics of people, like their demographics, map on to their needs and wants, then you can inform a whole campaign to go and attack those customers like we did with the Blazers. So that's having like a well-designed Qualtrics where maybe you've done some qualitative research, maybe you've already interviewed potential customers, so you know which questions to ask. But this is something that could be done by any of my students. They don't necessarily need a fancy research company. It's just building out a survey in Qualtrics, making sure it's formatted correctly so that it could be plugged into an analysis software, and then using just either signing up for marketing engineering, which is not that expensive, or learning a bit of R, which is free, just requires some time. This k-means output is very similar to what is being done in MarkStrat. So you can see like here's these dendrograms. This is output from R, a little bit different than what I did. You can see these are kind of like those same maps to try to look at the different clusters in a two-dimensional space. So it's, if you have clients that you get to pay you to do this, maybe you want to use something like Ingenious because the output looks a little bit better. So it looks like, hey, look what we did, and you can go ahead and talk through like, the differences among customers and justify getting paid a high rate. But really, it just, ultimately, yeah, you want to create something that looks good, a report or a presentation, using different, symbols or whatever. But it can be really powerful. So in this case, my students in the project designed Facebook ads the Blazers launched. And I think we got about, I want to say $30 of ticket sales revenue for every $1 spent on advertising. And obviously that was uneven across the different ads. Some ads were more effective, some ads were less effective. So you can know segments, you can design ads for those segments, you can create multiple ads for the segments, you can see which ones work, and then from that you can inform a bigger strategy of how to engage different groups of potential customers. All right, that's the gist of cluster analysis for segmentation. Does it all align? Does it seem feasible? What questions did I miss?
All lines. I don't think there's any remaining questions. You went over it very thoroughly.
All right, cool. Well, if it's good enough for you, it should be good enough for all the students that I have. So hopefully you're not just saying that because you want to move on with your day. But
No, I'm not.
all right. So anyways, students out there, anyone interested in cluster analysis, I hope this video is a good tool to help kind of show what can be done. If you have good data, it's a really powerful tool to inform your marketing decisions. If you don't have good data, obviously it's not so important. So it does take some skill and experience putting it together. But once you have the data set, I think just following along with this video, any of my students should be able to analyze it and interpret the output and use it to inform decision making. The actual entry and button pushing of the analysis is super easy. Like once you have it in the right format, which is kind of hard, and if you ask the right questions, you know, even if you've never used R before, it would only take you maybe a weekend of watching YouTube videos and downloading the free software to be able to run the analysis, assuming you have good data in the right format. And you can kind of see how this data corresponds to this potential survey question. So you could imagine actually taking a survey with these questions and then seeing how, if that data is downloaded and formatted correctly to map onto the formatting I show you here, that's kind of all you need as a starting point. Super easy, although it's unfamiliar, so anything unfamiliar doesn't seem easy, but you'd be surprised at how soon you could pick it up. Okay, an hour and 20 minutes. I think that's good enough.